Welcome back, artists. I'm Wyatt Paints, and this week, the artists over at Super Shark are taking us into the absolute universe with their take on Absolute Doomsday. And this vicious villain does not disappoint. But before we get started, I do want to give you a heads up that this project is going to require us to really step up, but don't worry. As always, I'm going to take you step by step so you can take it from a fresh print to fully colored for your shelf. So meet me over at the painting table. I'm going to grab my brushes. Let's get started. Now, this is definitely an advanced level project, and a good chunk of it is front loaded in the printing. Despite the well-made cuts to the model, all of the spiky bits still leave you with a very complicated shape to print, unless you're printing solid, which don't do that. Seriously, it would be pricey. Make sure to double check your hollowed print for any possible suction cups that can form from the spikes. Using a tiny 1.5mm hole is more than enough to release this vacuum, and afterwards it really easily filled with a drop of resin. But don't rely on these for any draining or cleaning. For those, I would say use multiple holes, and the bigger the better. The bigger holes will lead to faster and more thorough cleaning of the excess resin. With the model all prepped and primed, let's take a good look at this base. We have a nice mix of surfaces to contend with: broken asphalt, dirt, bare metal, and painted metal. So let's tackle this one at a time. To get us going, black metal. Oddly enough, this first step will be the shortest, as I just need to get a touch of color on the hubcap and the front plate. It would really only take a couple of swipes to get the silver pop I want, and no need to get 100% coverage. I want some of that primer showing through to give me a touch of that built-in weathering. Just get it down and move on. Next, rough iron. Again, a quick overbrush to start coloring up the manhole is what I'm looking for. This should only take a few seconds to build up the bronze color, and so long as you don't overload your brush, you can maintain the nice shadows for free. The trick is to use sweeping strokes, no jabs. That way your brush runs across the details and keeps your shadows nice and dark. For a quick highlight, hammered copper. Here, it's mostly exactly the same as the last step, just this time with less paint remaining on the brush and a slightly lighter weight behind my hand. Almost imagine you're gently spreading around dust and you only want to move the very top layer of it. You should see the copper gently show up as you work your way across the cover, but don't be afraid to reinforce some areas. If needed, you can always reset this back to the rough iron and try again. 2 small bits down, let's keep moving. With desert yellow. Yep, it's my kryptonite, but it can't be avoided. While there are no obvious details that make this a cab, it's kind of expected for a metropolis street debris, as it being a cab submits the location to downtown metropolis without anything else. But in order to keep myself from hating every second of it, I started with a more mustard brownish yellow to give me better coverage. Now, if I wanted this to be a very vibrant yellow, I would have opted for an orange or a pink undercoat. If I did that, the cab would pull attention from Doomsday. So I want a more dull, desaturated yellow cab. In general here, I'm looking to get around 85% coverage. And that's when tragedy struck and my brush literally fell out of the handle. Sad days indeed. But to be fair, this wasn't really even a paintbrush. It's a makeup brush I've been abusing for the past 2 years. I picked it up in a bundle for about 10 bucks. So value extracted if you ask me. I guess I'll switch over to an actual paintbrush for dry brushing. And yeah, obviously this is going to be better at it. But I use the cheap stuff so you know that you can use the cheap stuff too. You don't need a $40 brush to do good work. Once the second coat was on, it was good to go. Next, dark stone was needed for the asphalt. This is what I would call a very slightly brown dark gray, which is just perfect for the broken street. Just slap this down across the tops and do your best to nail those edges. A small amount of brush abuse may be needed. For the last base color, dirt splatter. This will fill out all the general dirt areas around the bottom, so no need to overthink this. It's dirt. It's okay if it's a little bit messy and you have a bit of overspill. It'll all be tightened up in later steps, so swipe away with abandon. If it was super important to keep it clean, I'd be using a smaller brush. So it's all good. Dirt gets on stuff. Once it was dry, bingo bango, we were looking good. No worries. Now to get really dirty with some shade washing. First up, dark tone. This goes down on everything that isn't the yellow of the car, so it doesn't get easier than that. Now, 100% of your effort needs to be put on thinning this out as far as it can go so that there's no pooling. Using a large brush like this makes it pretty easy to mop up as I go, but you'll still need to take extra care whenever you reload. Try only loading a tiny corner at a time. It worked well for me. I then swapped over to light tone to shade the car body. I want an all-over slightly messy wash here. Not only is this going to give me some tone variation, this is going to give me an all-over dinginess to represent the grime, sewer water, and dust that's been rinsed over this car. Just do your best to have it gather in the deeper details to help with the overall readability. All dry and looking dirty. Time to brighten things up with some highlights. Working from the ground up, Desert Yellow came back to highlight all of the dirt in a medium dry brush. Just be sure to keep your strokes going parallel or away from the asphalt, and use individual strokes rather than a constant back and forth. This way, you'll have total control over the application. Try as I might, I was a bit heavy-handed with my highlight, but it's not too big of a deal. I can knock this back with a little bit of light tone to brown it down a bit. Just a soft stipple of light tone got me right back where I was digging the look. Next up, Castle Gray. Here, I want to first focus on catching the edges of all the broken parts. I really want these edges to have the most paint, so doing this first kind of sets the tone for the rest. Then I hit up the tops and give a bit of definition to all the surface cracks and contouring on the street. This has the added benefit of knocking down all of the shine left from the wash. Then I stepped up to Spaceship Exterior. This is super bright, so you're going to want a feather light touch along the very tight paint control. So I swapped to Big Floof to make it a bit easier on myself. It's always my go-to when I need a crisp whisper light dusting. And because this is so light, we have a little bit of leeway when it comes to overpainting and get a bit of overspill. Just don't get silly with it and you should be fine. Next, I turned to Pale Saffron to highlight the car. This gave me a decently vibrant yellow without being obnoxiously bright, but I wanted to get a bit of insurance against getting this on the asphalt, so a bit of masking was in order. That way, I can just focus on the surface I'm painting rather than the one I'm not. I'm keeping with Big Floof so I can pick up more of the surface details and so it can have a bit more of a rougher, more damaged finish. Here's where you really see the desert, light tone, and even the black primer that survived, and suddenly it just fits right in your mind. At least for me it does. It just needs a bit more purposeful damage for me to be sold. And to get that, I'm going to be pulling out some 1000 grit wet dry sandpaper. This is going to be the ultimate test of bravery and confidence in how light of a touch you can have. You want to lightly drag this across all of the surface and rub it down to the primer layer. You can just ease yourself to a nice worn damaged look. And remember, you're in charge of this. It only needs as much as you're willing to risk, but don't be afraid to be a little bit heavy on the corners. Even if you get a bit too excited and rub it down to the resin, it'll just look like it's been worn down to the bare metal. But for safety, just remember to give this a clear coat and you should be good. After that, a bit of black cleaned up the wheel and had me feeling like the main part of this base was good to go. We just needed to take care of a few of those scatter props. Like this hydrant, a key feature on any inner city street. I gave it a quick base with chaotic red to start. Get it down and all over, and no need for your tiny brush. Big fat brush will give us a nice and crusty look to build from by leaving those hard to reach areas nice and dark. A dragon red highlight comes in right after. I want to focus this on all the interesting details that I want to bring out. So my key areas are going to be the bottom ring and rivets, these 3 out pipes, and the iconic topper. If you make those parts look good, the whole thing looks good. Finally, a bit of gunmetal. I'm dry brushing on a very light sheen over the finer details. This will give the impression that the hydrant has been made of metal and the red paint is fading and flaking off on the sharper bits. This really adds a touch of realism without demanding dozens of hours to do or hundreds of hours to master. Just keep it light and barely there, and you should get good results. Hydrant done. Moving on. Now there is an interesting I-beam. I usually do these in a rusty orange brown, but let's switch things up and go with a shiny steel, starting with black metal on the base. This is going to be the same step over and over again, with the only difference being that I want to use lighter pressure and less paint on my brush for each pass. So here I got a 90% coverage with the black surviving in just the deepest corners. Then I stepped up to gunmetal. Here I just avoided all the recessed panels entirely with a focus on getting crispy edge highlighting. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. Next, time to paint what I'm going to call the Super Shark Sewer. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I'm going to take that to heart and paint this just the same as the manhole. Starting with a rough iron base, followed with a hammered copper highlight. Now, there is some goo modeled behind those bars, but I like the look of a dark pipe. It's a bit more dramatic. Sculpting choices like this leave that decision up to me, which I like. 2 points for Super Shark. For the last detail on the base, we have these stones, and I'm going to keep them basic gray, but I want to make sure that they're lighter than the asphalt. So I started with dark gray. Compared with the dark stone, this is more of a neutral gray, so it's not going to have the same slight brown tint as before. And since this was sitting on top of the card surrounded by yellow, it's going to give it an extra bit of pop. Now I need to step up the highlight to ash gray, and a wild big floof has appeared to give a nice and scruffy highlight. And I do mean scruffy. I want a rough edge to this highlight. This will help replicate the scruffing that happens to a rough rolled boulder as chunks are sheared off. So trying to keep the paint super clean here would actually be a bit counterproductive. So no big burning moments needed. Just keep it light and change your angle often so you can catch all of those interesting little details. And before you know it, you're gonna be done. One last thing, during the dry fitting, I noticed a little road bump that you might get hung up on. The keys in the slots for the rocks are pretty tight when it comes to tolerances. This long rock is going to need a little bit of applied pressure down from the top to snap it into place. Just be sure the key is lined up first or you're going to be pushing for nothing. The short rock on the car is going to need a little bit of surgery. I ended up chipping off about a third of the key, then lining it up and sliding it under the lip of the debris until it snapped in. This really isn't a deal breaker for me, as it's very common with sharp corner keys. If your calibration, internal supports, and print orientation aren't optimal, it could turn a tight fit into an impossible one. Modifying the key for a good fit is a minor footnote. And with that said, the base was complete. I lost the footage on painting the extra tire, but it went exactly like the one still attached to the car. And you might notice I haven't painted in the headlights. The honest reason why is I'm not that confident about pulling off painting what is a three-dimensional structure of chrome surface behind clear plastic on a 2D surface, at least not to the level that I would consider good enough. And while we should always practice to improve our craft, large pieces like this are not the best time to get in that practice. Instead, I painted in a way to minimize it as much as possible. Put it simply, a thing that's missing is less noticeable than the thing that's there and done poorly. For example, have you noticed this car has no windshield? It should have one, but it doesn't. And you don't really notice it as much compared to if I had painted a bad one. Ambiguity can be your friend. The base is done, but Doomsday isn't quite here yet, so it's a great time to take a moment to thank my subscribers over on Patreon. 2025 is shaking up to be a wild year, and nothing fills my heart with more confidence than when I look up into the halls of the painting pantheon and see the names of greatness etched in there every month. These titans of industry see fit to share their bounty every month and make sure old Wyatt keeps on cranking out content. I truly can't thank you enough. If you would like to join the Painting Pantheon, you'll find a link to my Patreon in the description below. You can even join for free to give me an internet high five. Or you can support the channel right here with a like and subscribe. Every bit counts. And speaking of supporting, I'd like to give a special thank you to our sponsor today, Super Shark. They sculpted this and many other top tier statues that I've featured here on the channel. They even do characters that don't have movies coming out. So if you want to get your hands on this and many other models, be sure to check out their link below. You might just find your next project. For now, Doomsday's a knockin', so we better answer. Looking at Doomsday, first impressions are intimidating, and I'm getting strong Diablo vibes. While there are a lot of directions I can go with this, I want to anchor this contemporary look with his classic color scheme. Doing so immediately simplifies this to just two surfaces, his rocky gray skin and the bone talons and claws. And no worries, we don't have to paint this all as one piece. It's well cut to give us easy access to everything. To get going, I'm going to start like the large stones with deep gray. This is sort of a no-brainer here, but I do have the issue of making sure the skin isn't too similar in tone. Thankfully, all of the extra surface detail here will pick up a lot more extra contrast, so it won't end up looking too same. When putting on this base coat, I'm using an overbrush technique so I can maintain some amount of that black primer in the deeper cracks. I am going to reinforce them later, but any that's saved in this set will add some extra intensity later. Once it was dry, I felt it was on course and stepped up the ash gray for the highlight. Just like with the rocks, Big Floof is stepping up to catch every edge present. But even with a light pigment load, these surfaces are so detailed, each stroke will leave a lot more paint than you at first expect. So now more than any other point, you need to apply this one stroke at a time. Really take your time and ask yourself if you really need to add another stroke before you do it. It's the best way to ensure an even highlight. Time to get dark again with dark tone. Just a quick all over shading. And I want a bit of variation when it comes to the raised surfaces, so a little bit of a stipple here will do great. It'll leave me a nice spotty shading on top while pushing the deep shading into the cracks. Just be sure not to overdo this and flood your model. Now to just top off our peaks again with ash gray, and Big Floof as usual was in a pinch. Just keep this dusting as light as you can. Yep, I'm talking about fart on the moonlight, weightless. With my grays done, Doomy was looking ready for his bones, and nothing makes more sense than skeletal bone. Unfortunately, there comes a point in time in every project when I've got to put away my big front brushes and slow down to paint clean. I try to minimize this as much as I can, but it's necessary. This is a good time to put on a movie you've seen dozens of times and just can listen to. And because this is a pretty light tone over black, you really can't get a good saturation in one coat. So don't even try. If it looks solidly done in one pass, you need to thin your paints more. If you just leave it like that, you really can't tell how much pigment has been stacked up there. So while it looks all covered, you're going to have areas where it's much thicker coverage than others. This makes the surface very uneven, like rolling hills. When light hits those surfaces, those hills will cast shadows. This is what leads to a chunky and chalky looking finish. When you properly thin down your paints, it makes it harder for the pigments to stack up on each other too high. While these thinner coats don't cover as well, they're much more consistent in thickness. So once you get full coverage, the difference between the thickest coverage and the thinnest coverage is pretty close, resulting in an all-over consistent surface. After a few coats, I was ready for a light tone shading. I broke this up into 3 phases, but first be sure to thin this down as well. We want as much control over the intensity as we can get. I want to use the layer count to control that, rather than relying on trying to feather everything in one go. I want to focus phase 1 only around the bases of each bone and start filling in the surface cracks. Just be sure to give a solid 10 to 15 minutes for the shade to dry between each coat, as it can reactivate if you do the next application too early. For phase 2, as more and more layers are added, the deeper lines separating each element become more defined, while I loosen the boundary of how far out the shade can extend. Here, it's critical not to leave so much on that the shade collects. With all the added water, this becomes a much faster paint. So even a slight overload can lead to a stream of shade sliding off the surface and down into the cracks, dripping from the underside of the part. Just a few taps on the back of your hand after every reload can go a long way to preventing this from happening to you. And using the side of your brush for this stipple is also a pretty good idea. Finally, in phase 3, I thin the tone down even more and extend the weathering haze even further away from the root. This will help tie everything together and get nice even transitions. And right about now, I imagine some of you may be yelling at the screen about me not painting those heel bones. No worries, I didn't miss them. I just left them for last so I'd have an easy way to set this down and dry. These little boogers are wily. And while I could have painted more of these spikes, I like singling out just this one massive one. It reminded me a lot of X23. With those heel spikes catching up, it's now back to even more shading. This time on the back. While I finish this up, I figure I might touch on something with my inspiration with Doomsday here. You see, I'm foregoing painting the eyes altogether, and here's why. DC is setting up the Absolute Universe to be their version of the Ultimates universe. So gritty and grounded, but pushed to the DC extremes. With that in mind, Doomsday has the unique physiology that he self-resurrects and evolves himself against whatever had killed him. In my head, he would evolve some kind of extrasensory perception, no longer needing eyes and ears. Therefore, they would be sealed up in the complete exo armor, covering up one of his few vulnerabilities. That way, even a creative Thanos plan wouldn't work on him. If you know, you know. And if you don't know, you can look it up. Thanos. You have been warned. With the final shading coming together, it was time to knock it down and clean it up. First, with the original skeletal bone and a very controlled medium dry brush. Be careful with your aim here. You don't want to mess up any of the already completed grays. Thankfully, it should be pretty easy as these are nice and raised above that gray surface. Just start at the tip and slowly inch this down towards the base of each spike. You only really want to push this skeletal bone on the top third of each spike. So just take your time and ease it up each spike one at a time. And remember, you want to use a sweeping motion across the bones. Stabbing or stippling will start to fill in all those interesting cracks that we took all that time to shade. For the final highlight, Gray Matter Beige, we are back to our moon fart light dusting. Here, I really want to use as few strokes as possible to just barely catch the edges to put that final exclamation point on this amazing model. This is the part I consider my victory lap just before assembly, because even in pieces, I know this is going to be awesome. So without wasting any more time, I glued him up and called him done. And oh boy, did he turn out great. Definitely old school meets new school. The extra bonus of doing a model like this is that you don't have a comic reference yet. There's no wrong answers. Heck, I could have leaned in hard to the Diablo vibes I was getting, and that would have worked great too. But that's in no small part due to the amazing sculpt done by Super Shark. So once again, I want to thank Super Shark for being today's sponsor. If you want to get your hands on this model and support those that support the channel, head over to Super Shark and give them some love. They deserve it. And if you do this model, I would love to see it. If you send it to my Instagram, I'll be sure to check it out. But for now, I got the next project waiting to get painted, so I gotta go. So as always, thank you for watching, stay creative, and always enjoy the process.